Good evening, and welcome on behalf of the New York Society Library. I'm Sarah Elliott Holliday, Head of Events, and we are honored to have with us tonight Hayden Herrera, author of Upper Bohemia, which was published officially just 2 days ago. Hayden Herrera is an art historian and is the well-known author of biographies of Frida Kahlo, Arshile Gorky, Mary Frank, Isamu Noguchi, and Henry Matisse. Her Kahlo biography was the basis of the 2002 film Frida. Her biography of Gorky was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and her biography of Noguchi won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. Of Upper Bohemia, the new book, Daniel Okrent said, "For a biographer, looking into one's own life can be a risky enterprise. For a biographer as accomplished as Hayden Herrera, it has turned out to be a risk worth taking. Her beautiful, entitled, and rather heedless parents may have failed at making households, but in the pages of Upper Bohemia, the author has found her way home. Her book is honest, revealing, and deeply felt." Please join me in welcoming to our virtual stage, Hayden Herrera.
Is that done it?
We can hear you. And let's see.
Oh, the camera. Okay.
Camera.
There we are. Okay.
Yeah, welcome.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening. So you'd like to start with a reading from the book and let us know what it's about?
Yes, I'm going to read a page and a half from the preface because it sort of tells you what the book is about. Okay, here we go. Our mother was a terrible mother, wasn't she? My sister and I share a rueful laugh. Part of each of us wants to say, no, she was wonderful. After a pause to search through memory, one of us nods. Yes, she was a terrible mother. But our terrible mother gave Blair and me, Blair's my older sister, a wonderful life. And she was not the only terrible mother. Most of our friends had terrible mothers too. When we talk with friends about our mothers, we compete to see who has the worst, most terrible mother. In fact, this sort of competing over the terribleness is consoling. Our mother's terribleness becomes a joke. It's really not fair. Our fathers are off the hook. For all his charm and wit, Blair's and mine was an absent father. As one of his wives observed, your father never lost a night's sleep over anybody. In addition to their numerous love affairs, my father and mother were each married 5 times. They believed in the importance of pleasure, of living life to the hilt. To follow their own desire was a moral imperative. Repression, sacrifice, and compromise were cowardly. What our parents desired was not always in the best interests of their children. If they fell in love or had to pursue a new lover, they did not hesitate to stash their children with some friend, relative, or boarding school. Children were secondary to the leading of a passionate life. What I want to understand, and that's perhaps why I wrote the book, is how could our mother have behaved the way she did? And what made the parents of our friends be so impervious to their children's needs? Why did our father think it was acceptable to live in another country and to turn up now and then with a new wife? And why, if they ignored us, were Blair and I so captivated by our parents? Our mother called her friends Upper Bohemians. Most were artists or writers living in Manhattan or the Outer Cape, Wellfleet, Truro, Provincetown. And most were born between 1908, that was when my parents were both born, and 1920. These so-called Upper Bohemians had privileged childhoods, but rebelled against their parents' way of life. They rejected convention and insisted upon personal liberty. Their lives were full of pleasure and drama, mixed with chaos. The flush of excitement that came with a new love affair made a marriage worn down by progeny seem dull. The sense of security and continuity of duty fulfilled that might have come from sticking with a spouse for the sake of the children was not enough to hold them back from the thrill of the unknown. So that's a piece of the preface describing that milieu in Provincetown, New York, Mexico.
Thank you. And also explaining the title a little bit, which I think is
Yes,
very evocative.
yeah.
So as we've just heard, you have published several wonderful and highly acclaimed biographies. So what was it like turning the biographer's lens on your own life?
Well, it was a relief in the sense that I was, when I finished the Isamu Noguchi biography, I was in my mid 70s, I think. And and then that biography took about 8 or 9 years. And I thought, I'm not sure I'm going to live long enough to do another of these biographies because they really take forever. And I wasn't really thrilled at the idea of spending weeks and months in archives and taking notes and sorting information and writing footnotes. I wanted to work in a much more free, spontaneous, open way. But there are a lot of similarities between writing a biography and writing a memoir. So that it was a good practice for me.
And so I think you've just sort of answered this, but so what made you want to write the book at this time, kind of a gathering of perspective about your own life,
Yes.
perhaps? Yeah.
Yes. Well, there I was in my mid 70s and not wanting to write another biography, or maybe I was too lazy. I really wanted to be in my home rather than trancing around interviewing people. And so I started the memoir with the idea that it was for my children and grandchildren. And I thought that if they knew what had happened in my childhood, that it might give them some idea of where they came from. And actually, I think a lot of things are passed down to certainly to my daughter and then on to her 3 children and my son and his 2 children. So I just thought it would help them to know, because nothing ever goes away. But as I was writing, I write on in pen on paper, yellow pads, and pages were piling up, and I began to think, oh, I kind of like these stories. And I thought, then in comes ego. I decided I want everybody to read this story. And so I really wanted to find a publisher. And first it would have just been something that the children would have had. So I looked for a publisher, and what I really want is to have a broader audience. And I hope that some of those stories will help other people who have difficult childhoods. I think an awful lot of people do, and it might help them.
Yeah. So one of the defining things about the book is that your parents and family moved you around constantly during your childhood. You mentioned your 8 different schools prior to the 8th grade, but you also record many vivid memories, not just vivid, but tactile. There's specific foods and experiences of swimming and knitting and specific interactions with some different animals who all kind of have different characters. So did the different tactile experiences differentiate the many places you lived? And can you talk about how you recaptured those memories to describe them so precisely?
I know about the tactile thing, but I was trained as an art historian. Being visual is probably the key thing in both in my biographies and also, well, both my parents were painters also. So that sort of explains a little bit, and they value art above anything else. But for me, the thing is much more visual than tactile, although I'm glad you say it is tactile. The way I remember is a little bit curious, and I don't know if other people have this or this is standard in memory. I have a fleeting vision, just goes past my eyes, of something like my sister in the pond, or or my father with his bar, his thing to open bottles at the bar, or my red flowered curtains with the sun behind them, that the color suddenly glowed because the sun was coming behind them, that sort of thing. And then I, I have that flash, and then it expands. And I think of memory as a sort of sinking down into some deep place, and you almost have to relax, I think, and just you can't make it happen. It just has to come, I think.
You speak of your ongoing relationship with Leech Pond on Cape Cod, and I think some of the most wonderful descriptions are about being there or near there. At one point, the text says, "I did not want to leave Leech Pond. I think I loved the pond more than I loved my mother and father. The pond I could trust. It wasn't going to leave me. When I was in the pond, every part of my body was held." Can you elaborate on this idea a little bit? And is that relationship ongoing with Leech Pond?
It certainly is. It's, both my sister and I were taken from when we were born straight to Leech Pond. And the first, I guess my parents separated when I was 2.5 and Blair was about 5. But we still came back to the pond every summer to be with. Sometimes my mother used it, and sometimes it belonged to my father, but sometimes he let my mother use it, and sometimes he was there with us. The pond is the only reliable thing in my life, except my older sister, Blair. Blair and the pond are the two things that were constant. And I do. I mean, I feel so attached to that pond, and so does my sister. We're both pretty territorial about it. Both of us, I mean, we're sharing it this summer. She has it in July, I have it in August. But both of us hate leaving the pond so much that we each ended up buying a house in North Truro, so we wouldn't feel exiled by having to leave the pond. And I can read you a little. The pond also, for me, is like a source of memory in a funny way. I feel looking from the porch. Oh, I should explain to you that my father, in 1942, he raised turkeys on the other end of the pond. And then he took the turkey brooder houses and put them on the far end of the pond, and they became bedrooms. And then he built a one-room house with a beautiful porch that's about 3 feet from the water. So this is view from the porch. The wind picks up. I sit at our porch table and watch waves of light pass through lily pads and pickerel weeds as they move toward the pond's shore. One after another, the ripples touch the water's edge and sink into the deep like memories not set down. Imagining the pond's depths, alive with swaying lily pad stems, I can follow the strands of time back to the beginning. The pond water is the fluid of my birth. Every time I walk into it, I am born. If I stare at it, everything that happened, or most of it, will rise to the surface. So it is that sort of submerging thing. And the pond really helps. And we still have it.
It's beautiful. And the overlap there of biography and nature writing, or memory and nature writing of a kind, is really beautiful.
Yeah, the wonderful thing about biographies and memoirs is I'm not very brilliant about structure. I find I've recently tried to write fiction, and structure is hard. But biographies and memoirs are chronological, so it's sort of given. Of course, you can switch things around, but it's basically given. So that's makes you feel secure. Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So you mentioned at the end of the book working with your sister Blair, who, by the way, I also noticed took your beautiful headshot, so that's a plus too. But you mentioned working with your sister Blair and others you knew in your youth to pin down some of the details. Was other research required, and how was that similar to or different from researching biographies of others?
Yeah, it was quite different. Just speaking of Blair, I was full of trepidation to show her the memoir because it's very personal information about her. So I was very scared, and thank God she said she loved it. So that, and then she supplied half the photographs in the books are her childhood brownie camera snapshots. Um, but she said a lot of her, she doesn't have the same kind of memory, but also she remembered a few things differently. For example, she remembered that our setter dog was a blue setter, and I think it was a red setter. I mean, they're pretty trivial. Anyway, um, the other research, I read many letters from my father to his mother, and that there were quite a lot of them. He never wrote to his children, but he wrote to his mother. Um, and also Dr. Rollins. The Dr. Rollins was a sort of an uncle figure for my father who gave him the land in Cape Cod. He gave him 800 acres. So my father was pretty lucky to get to inherit that piece of land with various ponds and beach, ocean beach. It's wonderful. Now it's mostly national seashore, which is a good thing.
And you reached out to some of the other people who appear in the book for their memories also?
I didn't get much more. I mean, Penny Jenks, who's in the book, who's a sculptor who did Eleanor Roosevelt in Riverside Park. She remembered things. She sort of amplified the memories. For example, there's that thing where she tries to scare Blair and me when we're, I don't know, 5 years old or 6 years old, and she comes out of the closet. So she'd sort of say it again, and then I'd have it confirmed, which is helpful.
So Frida Kahlo and Arshile Gorky make cameos of a sort. They're kind of around the edges in this book, and each of them has been a subject of one of your previous books. Are those things connected at all, or how are they connected?
I don't think they are. The only thing that might be connected is the choice of subject matter. In that the artists that I chose to write about tended to have a lot of difficulty and sorrow. And so maybe I was attracted to those artists because I had a pretty difficult childhood. And I think maybe that might have been the thing that made me want to write about them. And then I turned to myself. But yeah.
Makes sense. So audience members, I just want to add, do please add your questions and comments in the chat, and we will incorporate them as we go along. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of parental figures in the book because there are two parents and then quite a few step parents and some grandparents. And the parents and step parents commit a lot of kind of casually cruel acts. I mean, Daniel Okrent said heedless, which maybe is a better word, and there's even some things that are really genuinely abusive. Thinking of the treatment of two of the dogs in particular, which really, was heartbreaking. But at other times, your parents seem fun. The step parents seem fun. And I was surprised by how much of the book was kind of humorous in a, sort of like, I can't believe this sort of way, but still sort of humorous. Was it a challenge to balance these elements in writing the book and capturing these real people as characters for the reader?
It's funny. I didn't know that it was humorous. There's a lot of joy in it. And there was a lot of pain in that life, but a lot of feeling abandoned and lost, and basically a tremendous feeling of loss. Every time I had to leave the pond, I'd go into a sort of terrible state. I still do. I hate leaving the pond. But as a child, I just tried to deal with whatever came my way because I didn't have any choice. And I think in some way it sort of gives you strength if you constantly have to cope with new things, deal with new people. My mother was a very positive person, and she probably handed that on to Blair and me and gave us a huge appetite for life. I mean, we really wanted. My mother was an adventurer. She loved seeing new things, climbing mountains, picnic on Popocatépetl. She just loved to do things, and that was fun. It was fun. there was some bad stuff too. But I that's why I say in the preface, she gave us a wonderful life.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe what I mean by humor is maybe humor is not at all the word, more like ironic. Like there were a few times where I was just sort of, but joy is a much more important word to bring up than humor. Absolutely. Certainly the deep appreciation, I mean, for nature, for the arts.
Mm-hmm.
And, um, and yes, thinking of the portrayal of your mother in particular, when she shows up with the car, whose name in Spanish I'm going to mispronounce.
The coche de mama.
Thank you. And says, we're moving to Mexico, like right now, pack a bag. And I was sort of thinking, you're not even going to leave a note, but also excitement.
Actually, that she didn't leave a note that my father didn't know made me quite nervous. But she just turned up. We really hadn't seen much of her. She'd gone to Mexico in 1948 to get a divorce. And when she turned up, it was 1950. We'd seen her briefly on Cape Cod and Tom's Lake. But she turned up in the fall of 1950 and just said, "This is the Coche de Mama. We're going to Mexico." And off we went. There we went. And it was an incredible trip. She packed the car with a mattress in the back. It was a great big Chrysler's wooden station wagon. And Blair and I sat on the mattress the entire trip to Mexico and slept on the mattress. My mother slept in a motel, but at least we could take a shower. That was good. It was exciting. I mean, the bad stuff happened. The car burst up, the engine, and there was a rattlesnake at a picnic. Stuff happened, but it was fun.
Yeah, and it's wonderful to read about in a kind of an adventure story sort of way. I mean, that episode in particular, but quite a few of the adjusting to new schools, to new places. It's
always scary a little bit, especially if we almost never got to a new school on time. Usually the term had already begun. That wasn't something she cared about.
So you mentioned writing this in part perhaps to be of help to other people with difficult childhoods. I wouldn't say that applies to me personally as a reader, but it did resonate with me because I'm also from what I might call a classic 20th century WASP ethos to some extent. And it seems like the life that your parents chose is also an outgrowth of that, but often it's a rebellion against it. We're not going to be nice, sedate people with, our China set and our et cetera. But there is a great value for high art or high culture or all kinds of art or culture, which I'd also sort of associate with that. At one point you mentioned your mother saying, for a Bostonian, your father was very passionate.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little about how your parents' cultural background informed their approach to life, either in alignment or in opposition?
They were from what my mother called good families and upper class, and they were brought up with money, most of which seemed to have vanished in the Depression. They were they were brought up with nannies, so they probably didn't see much of their parents either. And maybe that was sort of that made them think, they didn't have to see much of their children. We led very free lives. We were incredibly independent. Anyway, I don't know whether it's partly the Depression and the loss of money that made them more World War II or what. They changed their outlook, and they wanted to be artists, not stockbrokers or whatever. And they wanted to live a very free life. There was a lot of people felt that way, I think, after the war and after Prohibition. But their having been born into a certain class, WASPs, meant that they had automatic confidence. They didn't have to earn it. They didn't have to achieve anything. They both made it very well, but they didn't have a huge career, which I don't think they cared whether they did or didn't. The other thing that they had besides class and privilege was beauty. They were both unbelievably good looking. I mean, my mother looks like I think she looked better than Greta Garbo. And my father always reminded me a little bit of Gregory Peck, but I think he's better looking than Gregory Peck. Anyway, that made it so that they were instantly popular because looks seemed to help people.
Indeed.
Yeah.
If it's visible to the audience, there are the portraits
Yeah.
of the parents in the front of the book, and I agree that that's serious star quality.
Yeah.
Wonderful photos. So we've got a couple of good questions in the chat here that I think I might toss in. Thank you, Angie. You're asking, did you form any attachments to anyone who remained a strong presence in your life other than your sister? Is the constant.
Oh, one stepmother. Let's see, stepmother number 4. I adored Magooch. Her name Magooch was Arshil Gorky's widow. He killed himself in 1948, and in 1948, the end of 48, my father and Magooch and her 2 children with Gorky went to live in Italy. Well, they thought they were going to live in Spain. Actually, they ended up in France, having tried all these other countries. And then Magooch, eventually they came back, and I spent a lot of time with Magooch and loved her probably almost as much as I loved my own mother. And then when I was 12, I decided I really wanted her to be my mother, so I got christened, and she became my godmother. She and my father also had 2 more little daughters, so they ended up with, there were 2 stepsisters and then 2 pairs of sisters. And I got christened with my baby sister. One was 1, one was 2. That was so and actually I remained attached to Magooch until for the rest of her life, and she was my chief source for the Gorky biography that I wrote. That was, yeah, she was wonderful. Many, many hours of interviewing her.
I think that comes across in the book very strongly, actually. She's a really lovable figure, it seems to me, in the text.
And of course, all those the friends like Penny Jenks, I mean, they're all still friends. I mean, they're all still in Cape Cod. And Chemaevs and the Peterson, they're all still there.
So again, it comes back to the place as really the center.
Everybody loves their pond.
And a question here, there's a couple of other good ones that we'll come to. If your parents were primarily concerned with pursuing their passions, why do you think they chose to become parents?
Well, I think that was sort of, I think it was sort of what people wanted to do in those days, and many women still do. I think it just sort of came along, and I don't know whether they chose, but it happened. I think
that was my word, not the question.
She must have wanted to be a parent, because you remember that period where I wanted to go live with my father and she wanted me to live with her in Mexico. Big court fight, and I was going to have to appear in the Barnstable court and pick between them. But I finally just gave up and stayed with my mother. Sort of. Anyway, but she must have wanted children because she fought for me at some point.
So a couple of good questions here. How did you, I'm just going to jump in the middle here. So we talked a little bit about the title, Upper Bohemia, and that it was a phrase of your mother's. How did you land upon it as the title for the book?
Well, I was going to have it be Upper Bohemia, a memoir of childhood or something like that. Because I realized that Upper Bohemia is a place, and I didn't want somebody to think it was part of a country in Eastern Europe. And I did have a little argument with the editor, and actually the head of Simon & Schuster said, it has to be Upper Bohemia. And I thought, and I was told, don't fight it. Just, don't fight it. So actually, I think he was right. I think it's a perfect title. So it works. I don't think people will think it's some country in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, because the cover of the book shows you that it's the United States.
It's yes, it really does capture very much I think the era and
Yes.
yeah, um, the main two figures, you and Blair. Um, and what do you think you would have done if your sister hadn't approved of the project? I mean, it could have still been for your children, I guess.
It could have been for the children, and I suppose I could have taken out the parts that offended her
Mhm.
and just had whatever happened to me, not what happened to her. But she didn't mind, so I would have been distressed because I dedicated the book to Blair,
Mhm.
and Blair and I, because of sharing Horse Leech Pond, have had quite a lot of conflict. We're both very territorial,
Mhm.
and whenever one of us leaves it for the next person, sometimes you leave little things around to say it's really mine. It's not yours, it's mine. But anyway, we've gotten over that in the last years. No,
Mhm.
there's no jealousy anymore, and I don't think there's any competition anymore, which is really nice. And both of us live in the same building in New York and live a few miles from each other in Cape Cod. So it's perfect for. I think it's a perfect setup for old age, actually,
That's
having a
wonderful.
sister in the same building.
Mhm.
That's good.
So an audience member cites the questions that uh, were part of your reading from the preface. I think, if I understand correctly, it's what I want to understand is how could our mother behave the way she did? What made the parents of our friends impervious to their children's needs? Why did our father think it was acceptable to live in another country? Those questions. Do you feel that in working on the book, you addressed or answered those questions, or are the questions continuing to be the
I,
frame for the
I
book?
probably will never come to a complete thing, but there's a lot of in the book about the times, the milieu, what Bohemians were feeling and thinking, and how they thought they ought to behave, and the whole thing about sexual freedom, nudity. My mother and father would apparently go to a nearby cocktail party at another pond right nearby, walking distance, with no clothes on, I was told. So they were pretty out there. They really were. Um, I think part of the reason I wanted to understand it more, and I think a lot of it had to do with making art, that they thought making beauty was more important than caring for the children. And also, they were just that adventurous. But I think one of the reasons I wrote the book was partially to find forgiveness for my mother, mainly. I think the trouble is that fathers don't even need forgiveness because one forgives them from the beginning. At least I did. But my mother, I struggled with her.
Mhm.
And
Um, so here's a great question, sort of tying on to that. As an adult and a mother yourself now, how do you feel now about thinking back to the many terrible mothers of your childhood? I mean, your step parents and other people's mothers and so on.
thinking back to them, well, in terms
Yeah.
of having my own children, my total determination was to be the complete opposite from my mother. I think a lot of women feel this way, that whatever their mother did was terrible, and I think actually each generation that I've watched, my daughter is even. I was a pretty good mother, pretty good. I sometimes erred, but um, because a lot of my mother is in me, and I sometimes behave in ways that she does. And my daughter is a better mother than I was. She has three incredible children, and she's just extraordinary with her children, and they seem to have no neuroses, which is amazing. Anyway, they're pretty perfect, all of them. And Margot, I think every generation was better with the children. I hope the next one. I hope the grandchildren are great parents. But we'll see.
Um, so a participant mentions, uh, these are her words, I'm currently shopping around a manuscript for my own coming of age story. I'm nervous about how it will impact my family, but I have this strong drive to publish my unusual story. Now that your story is published, how does it feel to have completed the project and have it out there?
Well, I guess it really is out there now. I mean, now that the 22nd was sort of a big day because it is. I remember when Frida first came out, and I was thrilled and scared because what if the public doesn't like it? You know, what if it gets a bad review? I mean, there's a lot of what ifs. It so far had really nice reviews because there are a lot that come before it's published. But I want my friends to like it, and you never know. You know, you can't ever be completely sure that people are going to love it.
Mhm.
Better, I want them to.
Um, so, uh, given that we have at least one writer or potential writer in the audience, you mentioned that you work on biographies that you write on large yellow legal pads, which I think is also the habit of Robert A. Caro, who is one of the library's trustees and who we had speak on his book about his process.
Uh-huh.
Are there any other tips or fun uh, ideas about writing or about researching biographies or memoir that you'd like to share?
Well, one thing that's, I mean, I've said that memory for me is seeing something and then part of it's imagination. There is a balance between memory and imagination, I think, and memory imagination pushes memory along. I mean, there's going to be some things, some dialogue you can never really. I can't remember exactly what my mother said in 1943, but I know what she would have said, and so I think that's good enough. Although you feel a little strange writing dialogue, but um, the there was something I was going to say. Tell me your question again, because there was something I had to say about biography. I know what it was. I know what it was. It's an endless research process, endless, and then the sorting out. You know, you have files and files and files of stuff, and I tried using FileMaker Pro. That was a complete nightmare. It was much better to have paper files. I like writing on paper because I love the feeling of the pen going across the paper. I almost feel as though my hand is doing the thinking. I mean, it sort of travels pretty fast. I write quite quickly. I'm dyslexic, therefore I read really slowly, really like 20 pages an hour or something. Um, but the writing process, it's though it just there's a current going from here to there to my hand, and it's a real pleasure. It's I write double spaced on the yellow pad so that I can insert things, and very often I write on the back of the page. And then it's wonderful when the pages pile up. You know, then you think, God, maybe I'm really writing a book. Yeah, this is kind of it's you know, and then you have a huge stack, and you think it's probably too long. Anyway, that's a little bit about the process.
No, it's beautiful. We have so many writers who are members of the library, and to have somebody find kind of the way that makes the thoughts flow onto the page in whatever form, it's a beautiful thing. And is there any comparison between that and other kinds of artistic production? Are you also
Painted.
paint and
I was both parents are painters. I thought, of course, I'm going to be a painter. But then I went to Radcliffe, which back then offered no art courses, only art history. Or if you wanted to do something with your hands, you had to take. I took a design course, but that was not art. I knew it wasn't art. So I ended up studying art history, and getting a PhD in art history probably because there was no art courses at college. I mean, then after passing the PhD orals, I suddenly hated art history. You know, it just was. I had worked so hard for so long, and so I started painting. And then the head of our department got very upset. You can't paint. You're not supposed to paint. We put all this education into you. You must not paint. But I liked my paintings, but I was not that good at it. And also, I got frustrated because it's really hard to paint a good painting, and you end up in a corner. And you don't know how to make that corner relate to the whole thing, and it's like a nightmare. Maybe art history is not very good for painters. I mean, all that training made me extremely critical of what I produced.
Huh. That's interesting. Well, I think it's wonderful, though, to be engaged in multiple areas of creative work, even if one of them is not the primary thing ultimately. Did one of the previous biographies you've written trigger the idea of creating the memoir?
No, it didn't. I think it was really that I just couldn't face traveling around interviewing people. Maybe I think it becomes sort of more of a homebody as you get older, and I like to, I like a room where I can write. I'm there, happy. I can control everything. So
Of one's own, we might say.
what's that?
A room of one's own.
Yes, yeah, a room of one's own. That's important.
A participant mentions that Anne Morrow Lindbergh said, "I think best with a pencil in my hand," which could kind of apply to visual arts, but also writing.
That's so funny because I have written a second memoir, which takes you from 12 to 21, age 21. And when I was at Radcliffe, Anne Morrow Lindbergh's daughter was my best friend. And she was very beautiful, really smart, majored in English. And then both of us got fed up with Cambridge, Massachusetts after sophomore year. And we both went to live in Paris in two different French families. Then we didn't like our French families either. So we rented an apartment together. So she was a really, really good friend. And her mother, oh, I don't know whether, no, it's not in this memoir. Maybe it is. I can't remember. Her mother and my mother were both at Chapin together. And my mother, being a bad girl, my adventurous mother decided to go meet some boys on the roof of Chapin. This would probably be, I don't know, if she was born 1908, she's probably 12. So 19, what? I can't do math. Anyway, so she went up and she was caught. And she was taken before student council, and Anne Morrow Lindbergh was the head of student council, and she prayed over my mother.
Drawing somewhat to a close here, and I very much appreciate everybody's time and your time and great insight. Hayden, I'm going to toss in one more kind of substantial question, if that's good. There's been a bit of a moment for memoirs about parents in the last decade or two. I think of Francine Duplessis Gray's Them, Jeanette Wall's The Glass Castle, Adrian Berdeur's Wild Game, which we had an event on, among others. How does Upper Bohemia fit or not fit with other books kind of this genre or subgenre? Maybe that's not quite the word.
I've read all of those. And of course, Adrian Berdeur's is about Cape Cod and a lot about Cape Cod. And I enjoyed all of them. Miranda, oh, that's something else. I read them all, but the memoirs that I really love are Mary Carr's memoirs. The Liars Club, I guess, is one. And anyway, I think she's extraordinary. And then, in a way, my memoir, Upper Bohemia, has all these photographs in the text, which was something I had to insist upon. It was almost like a photo album. And on that, I used as an example Sally Mann's book, her memoir. It's called, I can't remember, something like Jump Up or something. Sally Mann is the photographer who, famous, well-known photographer, and her book is it's marvelous. And I love the fact that the photographs are all right there. It made reading sort of more vivid in a funny way. So I was very happy that Simon and Schuster were willing to put so many photographs. Of course, in the first draft, I had maybe twice as many. More photographs almost than text. So
I agree that they enhance the experience a lot. So you mentioned that you have another volume of memoir in the works. Is that the next project aiming at publication, or is there something else? If you feel comfortable sharing that, it might be
that memoir. I will show it to Simon and Schuster sometime soon. But during the pandemic, I was in Puerto Rico on an island, an island called Vieques off Puerto Rico, and stuck there, the quarantine there. And I just decided, well, this is like a piece of time that doesn't connect with anything else. Why don't I try and write fiction? This is something I'd wanted to do all my life. For some reason I have this notion that fiction writers are more important than biographers. I don't know. That's just my probably not a good idea, but anyway. So I wrote a novel rather quickly and then rewrote it, and I'd still have to work on it because I haven't figured out about the narrative arc really well. So I'm going to keep on working on it. And then recently I've also decided, since I'm not good at the narrative arc, how about trying short stories? So I wrote a few short stories, but I haven't sent any of either the second memoir out yet. They need work.
Oh, it's wonderful to diversify into different forms. I mean, now that you've done biographies and memoir, and
it sort of makes sense to go to fiction, don't you think? I think.
Or just to try something else new and different.
Yeah,
that's great. So is there anything else you'd like to add that we haven't spoken about to the present?
I think we've covered memory and why I wrote the memoir, and I think we covered pretty much everything.
Well, thank you so much, Hayden Herrera. Thank you, audience members, for being with us.
But Sarah, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it, and I loved your library. I used it all the time when I lived on the east side.
Excellent. That's always great to hear.
Well, they had quite a lot of art books, which was helpful.
Most of a stack of them, so do come back. I'm